Every town carries its shadows, but some secrets are buried so deep that even the boldest men refuse to speak them. In the remote Kentucky hills, two brothers grew up surrounded by hardship, silence, and the crushing weight of isolation. When their father passed away, grief chained them tighter together, until the bond between them crossed a line that no law, no preacher, and no neighbor could ever forgive. From this forbidden union, a son was born. Marked by deformities so haunting, he became a living symbol of what should never have been. This is the story the community denied, a story written in whispers, shame, and the silence of men who swore they'd never tell. If you're drawn into stories that others are too afraid to uncover, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share this video with another brother who'd never believe this tale without hearing it himself. The story begins in the remote hollows of Kentucky, where two brothers were born into hardship. Their world was small, defined by mountains, dense forests, and a father who struggled every day just to provide. Life in the hills was unforgiving. The brothers grew up hauling firewood, trapping animals, and following their father on hunting trips that often meant the difference between eating or starving. Poverty shaped them, but so did silence. Their father was stern, a man of few words but heavy hands. He carried the exhaustion of generations, a man whose only comfort came from long evenings beside a worn wooden table with his sons. The brothers respected him deeply. His presence filled the cabin like smoke from the fire. He demanded strength, discipline, and loyalty, lessons carved into them long before they could read or write. But tragedy struck suddenly. Their father, weakened by years of labor and untreated sickness, collapsed one morning. By nightfall, he was gone. The cabin felt emptier than ever, leaving two young brothers alone. Grief hit them like a storm. Without their father, they were forced to rely on each other completely. What little security they had vanished overnight, replaced by fear and the crushing weight of isolation. Neighbors in the hills noticed, but rarely offered more than a nod. In those days, men kept to themselves. Survival was personal, and no outsider dared step too close to another man's burden. The older brother became protective, carrying himself like their father once had. He chopped wood, hunted, and tried to shield his younger brother from the worst of their hardship. But loneliness crept through every crack in the cabin. Nights were the hardest. With no father's voice, no guiding hand, silence echoed inside the wooden walls. The brothers would sit across from each other, their faces illuminated only by flickering lamplight, saying little but feeling everything. Their bond deepened. In the absence of other men, they became each other's world. Every task, every meal, every moment of struggle was shared. The outside world grew distant, and their connection grew dangerously close. Isolation warped their sense of normal. Where other men might have leaned on neighbors, they leaned only on each other. They found comfort in their shared grief, even as the line between brotherhood and something else began to blur. The cabin became both shelter and prison. Days blurred together, seasons shifted, and the brothers grew into men defined by silence, hardship, and the strange intimacy that comes when two lives are bound too tightly together. Villagers whispered quietly about them. Men passing through the area noticed how inseparable the brothers were. Like one man split in two, some said. But no one dared interfere, fearing what they might uncover. For the younger brother, dependence on the elder became absolute. Every choice, every decision flowed through the older man's hands. Without realizing it, he began to see his brother not just as kin, but as the center of his existence. The older brother carried guilt. He knew he could not replace their father, yet he tried. That weight pressed on him daily, twisting love into something heavier, something darker than even he could fully understand. Seasons passed. The men of the community avoided them, yet their presence was always noted. Two brothers living alone, tending their land, rarely speaking, rarely smiling. Suspicion followed them like a shadow that could never be shaken. Still, inside the cabin, their loyalty to one another was fierce. They laughed on rare occasions, shared stories of their father, and dreamed of futures they both knew would never come. Outside, silence ruled. Inside, only they existed. The hills had shaped them into survivors, but grief and isolation shaped them into something else. By the time the world finally noticed, the brothers had already crossed lines that no man was meant to cross. Isolation had a way of twisting the mind. For the two brothers, days bled into nights, and nights into endless silence. With no father, no uncles, and no neighbors close enough, they depended only on themselves. The older brother carried the burden of responsibility like armor. He hunted tirelessly, fixed the roof when storms split it apart, and kept the fire alive in winter. But with each passing month, the weight grew heavier. The younger brother, desperate for connection, clung to him. He followed him into the woods, copied his movements, and shadowed his every step. Soon their lives no longer felt separate, but one continuous existence. Men in town began to whisper when they rarely appeared. The way they looked at each other, the closeness they carried, unsettled others. "Those brothers don't act like ordinary men," one neighbor muttered over a jug of whiskey. Inside the cabin, boundaries began to fade. Nights stretched long, filled with silence too heavy for words. The older brother's hand on the younger's shoulder lingered. What once was comfort began to feel like something unspoken, forbidden. Loneliness became a third presence in the cabin, always pressing against them. With no fathers or uncles to guide them, no community of men to anchor them, the brothers drifted into waters few dared to acknowledge. One night, after too much moonshine and too many unspoken thoughts, the line was crossed. A bond that should have remained brotherly shifted into something darker, binding them in a way neither could undo. The cabin seemed to shrink after that. Walls leaned inward, trapping them in their decision. Silence deepened. They rarely spoke of what happened, but both knew they had stepped into a shadow they could not escape. When word reached the community that the brothers had sought a legal union, disbelief spread like wildfire. Some men swore it was true, others dismissed it as rumor. But suspicion clung to them like smoke. Old county records hinted at a signing before a local justice. Some said the brothers demanded recognition. Others believed it was done in secret, sealed by the silence of a man too afraid to intervene. The reaction was swift. Men who once traded with them kept their distance. Hunters avoided their trails. Whispers grew sharp, painting the brothers as outcasts, as men who had betrayed the laws of nature itself. Yet the brothers refused to separate. Defiance fueled them. In their minds, the bond was unbreakable. If men outside judged them, so be it. The cabin became their fortress, a world with only two inhabitants. The older brother hardened. He stopped making trips to town. He hunted deeper in the mountains, avoiding the eyes of other men. His loyalty to his younger brother became fiercer, even as guilt gnawed at him. The younger brother leaned further into the connection. He believed no other man could understand him. No other man could replace what they had created together. His devotion bordered on worship, fueling the darkness of their bond. Seasons changed, yet their silence remained. The hills echoed with the sound of distant gunshots and chopping axes, but inside the cabin, time stood still. Their world belonged to them alone, even if it was twisted. By the time whispers hardened into certainty, it was too late. The brothers had already taken their union too far, a decision carved into memory and marked by the consequences soon to come. Every man in the region knew of them, though few dared to speak openly. Their story passed between whiskey bottles, hunting trips, and porch conversations, always whispered, always with the same conclusion. Those brothers crossed the line. And yet inside the cabin, they lived as if the outside world had vanished. Whatever judgment came, whatever whispers echoed, they faced it together. In their silence, they had already sealed their fate. The union between the brothers eventually brought forth a son. His birth was whispered about in disbelief, yet undeniable. When the first cries echoed through the cabin, every man in the surrounding hills seemed to hear. The boy entered the world carrying the weight of his father's choices. His skull was misshapen, his jaw underdeveloped, and his gaze uneven. Each feature testified to the forbidden bloodline that had created him. Medical records were nearly non-existent. When a traveling doctor was summoned reluctantly, his notes described the child as fragile, weak, and carrying the unmistakable markers of inbreeding. But no words could capture the haunting presence he carried. The brothers, though consumed by shame, guarded their son fiercely. To them, he was more than a consequence. He was living proof of their bond. They shielded him from the judgmental eyes of other men. Neighbors avoided the cabin altogether. Stories spread quickly. The son's deformed face, his sickly frame, his unsettling stillness. Children of the hills were warned by their fathers never to wander near the brothers' land. The boy became a living legend. Men told stories on porches, describing his gaze as if it could pierce the soul. Some said he embodied the sins of his fathers. Others pitied his cursed existence. Inside the cabin, silence ruled. The brothers tended to the son with relentless devotion. They fed him, carried him, and sheltered him. Their protection was fierce, though the child himself could not escape the truth of his appearance. The older brother worked harder than ever. He hunted deep into the woods, determined to provide. The younger brother rarely left the boy's side, watching him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every time the boy ventured into the yard, neighbors glimpsed him from a distance. Their reactions never changed: widened eyes, muttered curses, and quick retreats. Fear replaced compassion, turning him into an outcast before he could speak. The son grew frail, sickly, and easily exhausted. Each step seemed a battle. His breathing wheezed in the cold Kentucky air, and his bent frame carried the legacy of choices he never made himself. Doctors, when pressed to comment, gave only clinical descriptions: malformed bones, fragile organs, shortened lifespan. But the boy's presence was more than medical. He embodied silence, shame, and the unspoken history of his fathers. Men in the community spoke less and less about him directly. Instead, his existence became a story told in half-sentences, in warnings, in averted glances. The boy lived, but he lived as a shadow. Inside, however, he was treated like a son of kings. His fathers gave him everything they had: food, warmth, protection. They believed shielding him could somehow erase the deformities etched into his very body. But nothing erased the truth. Each year his features grew more severe, his health more precarious. Every visitor who glimpsed him returned unsettled, shaken by the undeniable mark of unnatural lineage carved into his form. The brothers wrestled with despair. One blamed himself silently, believing his choices had cursed the child. The other clung to stubborn defiance, insisting their son was proof of love, even if the world recoiled. The cabin became a monument to secrecy. It was both sanctuary and prison, protecting the boy while isolating him further. The walls held in devotion, but also contained the haunting silence of generations collapsed inward. By the time the son reached adolescence, the deformities could no longer be ignored, not even by his fathers. His features shocked strangers instantly. His frail body seemed to stagger under the very weight of existence, and yet, within those crooked bones and uneven eyes, the boy carried more than tragedy. He carried the undeniable truth of his bloodline, a truth that no man in Kentucky would ever dare forget. The cabin stood like a scar in the Kentucky hills. Weathered timbers leaned with age, smoke curled reluctantly from its chimney, and whispers about its inhabitants drifted between men who gathered on porches and dirt roads. Inside, life moved in silence. The brothers and their son rarely left the boundaries of their land. Every sound, the crack of an axe, the clatter of dishes, the boys coughing, echoed endlessly. The older brother carried himself like a sentry. He patrolled the woods, hunted tirelessly, and made sure no stranger lingered too close. The younger brother became caretaker, hovering over their frail son with fierce devotion. The boy, though frail, was treated like the center of their world. His every breath mattered. His every step was guarded, yet his crooked frame and uneven face betrayed secrets that no wall could hide. When neighbors passed along distant trails, they glimpsed shadows through broken shutters. They spoke of two men protecting a boy with unsettling features. No one dared approach. Fear made the cabin a forbidden landmark. Men in town whispered cautiously. They described the brothers as ghosts, men who had abandoned community, law, and natural order. Their son was seen as living proof of choices that no other man could justify. Inside the cabin, devotion clashed with despair. The older brother grew weary from labor, his hands cracked and scarred. The younger brother grew quieter, staring at the boy for hours, as though searching for answers. Nights stretched heavy. The three of them would sit around a weak fire, their faces lit dimly by flickering light. No words passed easily. Silence became the language binding them together more than speech. The boy rarely spoke. His awareness of his appearance weighed heavily. He avoided the gaze of strangers, knowing the shock it caused. His silence mirrored his father's, making the cabin a chamber of unspoken truths. Occasionally, distant relatives passed through the hills. They left quickly, disturbed by what they saw. Two men consumed by secrecy, and a boy whose form reflected the cost of their forbidden bond. The cabin itself became symbolic. To outsiders, it was not just wood and stone, but a monument to shame. Fathers warned their sons, "Don't go near that place. Nothing good grows inside those walls." And yet, for the brothers, the cabin was sacred. It was the only space where judgment couldn't reach. Within those creaking boards, they could convince themselves that loyalty was stronger than the world's condemnation. But the weight of silence pressed harder with each year. The older brother's shoulders slumped under invisible burdens. The younger's eyes sank with guilt. Even the boy's crooked frame seemed bent by the cabin's suffocating air. Neighbors noticed changes. The brothers no longer came to town for supplies. They sent the boy on rare errands, his appearance sparking fear and pity in equal measure. Men whispered, but none dared confront them directly. At night, hunters passing nearby swore they heard strange sounds, coughing, muttered voices, the groan of timber. They avoided the land, claiming the air itself felt cursed, as though the cabin carried a spirit of dread. Inside, the brothers doubled down. They reinforced walls, repaired the roof, and stacked wood high. Their determination to preserve the cabin mirrored their desperation to preserve the life they had built, no matter how twisted. Still, silence lingered heavier than smoke. The cabin no longer felt like a home. It became a prison, binding the brothers and their son to choices carved long ago, choices that no man could undo. By the time seasons turned again, the cabin had become legend. Men spoke of it quietly, shaking their heads. For all its wood and stone, it was made of something heavier: secrecy, grief, and silence. The men of the hills spoke in hushed tones whenever the brothers were mentioned. Around campfires, on porches, and inside taverns, whispers carried the same warning. Those men broke the order no man should cross. Judgment came not through courts or sheriffs, but through silence. Other men avoided their land, refusing to trade, refusing to share work, refusing even to acknowledge them when passing along narrow dirt paths. The brothers became outcasts. Men who once nodded politely now turned their heads. At gatherings, no one spoke their names aloud. The son became a living reminder of what no man dared accept. Some fathers used the story as a lesson. They warned their sons that isolation could twist men, that silence could breed madness, and that some bonds, if left unchecked, turned against nature itself. The boy's presence unsettled every man who saw him. His crooked features and frail steps inspired fear more than pity. Some whispered he carried a curse. Others said he was punishment made flesh. When the boy entered town for supplies, men stared in uneasy silence. No one mocked him, but no one spoke to him either. Their judgment came in averted eyes and quickened steps. The older brother bristled at the rejection. He clenched his fists when men looked away, his silence more threatening than words. The younger brother, however, retreated further inward, broken by the weight of judgment. The cabin became their refuge against outside condemnation. Inside, they convinced themselves the world was cruel, not them. Yet the silence of other men echoed louder than words, shaping every choice they made thereafter. Even distant relatives avoided them. Letters were never answered, visits never repeated. The brothers had become a parable, their son the evidence of what could happen when grief and desperation consumed men completely. Stories spread further with each season. Hunters carried tales beyond the hills. Traders muttered their names at taverns miles away. The legend of the brothers and their marked son grew larger than the men themselves. Judgment was not only social but spiritual. Preachers spoke indirectly, warning of sins that led to deformity and curses. Though no names were spoken, every man knew who the warnings pointed toward. The brothers responded with defiance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their silence unbroken. They refused to abandon their son, even as whispers turned into avoidance, and avoidance turned into fear. They embraced their outcast status fully. The boy, though silent, understood everything. He saw the eyes that turned from him. He felt the weight of men's judgment pressing harder than his crooked bones. Silence became his shield, but it also imprisoned him. Occasionally, men attempted kindness. A neighbor once offered venison, only to have it returned wordlessly. Another tried speaking to the boy, but the older brother intervened, his glare enough to end the attempt. Judgment turned to myth. Some men said the boy never aged, that he was trapped in childhood forever. Others claimed he roamed the woods at night, a figure of twisted bone haunting the mountainside. The truth was simpler, yet harsher. The boy lived, but under constant judgment. His life became the story men used to measure their own morality, their own fears, their own fragile boundaries of brotherhood. By the time years passed, silence had hardened into permanence. No one dared confront the brothers directly. Their judgment was indirect, but absolute. In every whispered warning, the community spoke. Those men are lost. And yet, the brothers endured. Their loyalty to one another and their son outlasted the whispers. Judgment surrounded them like smoke, but inside the cabin they remained bound together, refusing to break no matter the cost. The boy's growth brought no relief. As he entered adolescence, his deformities only deepened. His limbs bent unnaturally, his gait unsteady, and his face carried the unmistakable weight of a bloodline twisted by isolation. The older brother saw every step as a battle. He pushed the boy to walk farther, breathe deeper, and endure longer. Yet exhaustion defeated him quickly. His body simply could not carry the burden. The younger brother hovered constantly, watching each movement with fear. He interpreted every cough as danger, every stumble as catastrophe. His worry carved deeper lines into his face than labor ever could. The boy himself grew quieter. He spoke rarely, his words clipped, his eyes downcast. He knew the judgment of men outside the cabin and felt the silent pressure of his father's watchful stares. Inside, the cabin became more oppressive. The boy's frailty limited their world further. Trips outside grew fewer. Days blurred into nights of silence, broken only by the sound of firewood crackling and the boy's shallow breaths. The older brother carried the weight of defiance. He hunted with fury, chopping down trees as if anger itself fueled him. His silence masked guilt, but his eyes betrayed the torment of choices he couldn't undo. The younger brother carried guilt differently. He withdrew, spending hours seated by the boy's side, staring at him like a mirror of their own decisions. His devotion was both tender and suffocating, love wrapped in regret. The boy's presence haunted outsiders. When glimpsed, men whispered of his stillness, of how his uneven gaze seemed to cut through them. Some said he carried the judgment of every man who looked upon him. Legends spread. Hunters swore they saw him standing motionless at the edge of the woods, watching silently. Others claimed he disappeared into the trees at night, a crooked shadow blending with the darkness. The truth was simpler. The boy rarely left the cabin, and when he did, it was under the watchful eyes of his fathers. He never strayed far, his body too weak for distance. Inside, tension grew. The older brother urged the boy toward strength. The younger insisted he needed protection. Their disagreements often ended in silence, each man unwilling to speak truths they both already knew. The boy, caught between them, became a symbol of everything they carried. His body reflected their union's cost. His silence mirrored their shame. His every movement deepened the shadow cast over the cabin. Men in town speculated constantly. Some said the boy wouldn't live beyond 20, others insisted he was already cursed, his very existence proof that their line was doomed before it began. None spoke aloud to them. The brothers refused pity. When men offered it, they recoiled. When whispers grew louder, they retreated further. Their bond tightened, even as the boy's presence made it impossible to escape the shadow of their decisions. Seasons passed. The boy's health declined. His steps grew slower, his breath shallower. Yet his eyes, uneven as they were, carried a strange clarity, as though he understood more than his fathers wanted to admit. The cabin darkened with despair. Each day felt like waiting for a storm that never ended. The boy's weakness, their silence, and the judgment outside created a heaviness that no fire could chase away. And so, the brothers endured, caught between guilt and devotion. Their son's shadow stretched across every moment, every choice, every breath. What began as secrecy had grown into a burden that consumed them all. By then, the growing shadow was no longer just the boy's form. It was the legacy of two men bound by grief, silence, and defiance, a legacy that refused to let them go. The boy's adolescence gave way to adulthood, though frail and marked by illness. His body carried deformities too visible to ignore, and his presence reminded every man who saw him of the unnatural union that created him. Whispers spread across generations. Fathers warned their sons of the cabin, teaching that grief, silence, and isolation could twist men beyond recognition. The boy became more than a person. He became a cautionary tale. The older brother aged quickly, his back bent from years of labor, his hands calloused beyond repair. He carried regret like a second skin, yet refused to abandon the son who bore their legacy. The younger brother became increasingly withdrawn. His eyes carried shadows deeper than the surrounding woods. He rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, his silence heavier than any words of apology or confession. The boy, though grown, remained dependent. His body betrayed him daily, his breathing labored, his movements clumsy. He relied on his fathers for survival, though he was fully aware of the burden he represented. Generations of men beyond the hills spoke of him. Hunters described glimpses of his crooked figure. Traders repeated rumors at taverns. Slowly, he became a legend. Not entirely man, not entirely myth, but both. The cabin bore the weight of their history. Its walls sagged, its timbers groaned, yet it stood as testament to secrecy. Men avoided it, claiming the air around it carried silence too heavy to bear. Relatives distanced themselves entirely. No uncle, cousin, or brother dared associate with the household. The legacy was considered poisoned, and bloodlines carrying their name were whispered about with suspicion even miles beyond the hills. The older brother wrestled with pride and shame. He saw his son as proof of devotion, but also as punishment. His silence grew more rigid, his face carved by guilt he never confessed aloud. The younger brother retreated fully into despair. He barely left the cabin, preferring to sit beside his son. He seemed to find penance in the boy's presence, even as it broke him further. The boy became watchful. His gaze unsettled other men who avoided his eyes. Yet within his stare was something reflective, an awareness that he represented choices too heavy for anyone else to confront. With each year, the family's isolation deepened. Other men stopped speaking of them openly, yet the story never disappeared. It passed in whispers, carried by memory, fueling a legacy that refused to fade. When the boy struggled through his 20s, frailty consumed him. His body weakened, his breath shortened, his form bent further. Each day felt like a reminder that bloodlines twisted by isolation could not escape decay. Still, the brothers shielded him. They believed their silence was loyalty, that enduring judgment was their fate. They never spoke of leaving, never spoke of abandoning him, never spoke of undoing the legacy they created. The cabin turned into a monument of burden. Its creaking walls symbolized more than shelter. They symbolized the cost of choices made by two men who believed silence was strength, though silence was their undoing. Even as time blurred, men continued telling the tale. In warnings, in stories by the fire, in passing comments on porches, the brothers and their son became the legacy every man feared inheriting. The burden extended beyond blood. It became a warning carved into memory, passed across generations of men who swore they'd never let silence or grief twist them into repeating the same fate. And so, the son carried not only his own frail existence, but also the weight of a legacy larger than himself. A burden born from forbidden brotherhood, carried into history by whispers that never ended. The cabin eventually fell into ruin. Its timbers rotted, its stones collapsed, and vines crawled over the roof. Yet no man who passed by forgot the shadows of the brothers and the son within. Even when the cabin disappeared, the land carried memory. Men avoided hunting there. Travelers quickened their steps along nearby paths. The air itself seemed heavy, as though silence had permanently settled across the hollow. Stories passed through generations. Fathers told sons about the brothers who defied natural order, about the son who bore deformities as living proof, and about the silence that consumed them all. Hunters repeated the tale around campfires. Traders carried it into distant taverns. The legend grew, reaching men who never stepped foot in Kentucky. The cabin's story became larger than the hills that birthed it. The older brother's fate remained uncertain. Some said he died beside the cabin, refusing to leave. Others claimed he wandered into the woods one final time, his silence swallowed by the mountains he once hunted. The younger brother was remembered differently. Men said he never left the boy's side, even in death. His devotion became part of the legend, a symbol of guilt disguised as loyalty to blood. The son's story lived on most vividly. His crooked frame, his uneven eyes, his frail existence became the details whispered most often. He was remembered as a symbol, both victim and burden of unnatural choice. Men disagreed about meaning. Some argued the story warned against isolation. Others believed it was punishment for betrayal of law and order. Yet all agreed. The cabin proved silence could consume men entirely. No records survived officially. The tale was carried only in memory and rumor. Yet memory was powerful. It ensured the brothers and their son would never truly vanish from the minds of men. Decades later, hikers claimed to see shadows at dusk. 3 figures near the ruins, one smaller than the others. Whether truth or imagination, the legend breathed with every retelling. The land itself became untouchable. No man built on it, no man cleared it, no man settled there. The ruins remained a scar across the hills, preserved by silence and fear alike. Fathers used the tale as warning. They told their sons, "Grief without guidance can twist men. Silence without brotherhood can destroy. Never let isolation lead you where those brothers once went." In this way, the burden became communal. The story was no longer only about two brothers and their son. It was about every man who listened and swore never to repeat their fate. The hills changed with time, but the story remained. Roads were paved, towns grew, men came and went, but whispers of the cabin never disappeared. Some truths outlived the men who created them. For many, the tale carried fear, for others, pity. Yet beneath both emotions was recognition. Recognition that silence, grief, and desperation were dangers every man might face in his darkest moments. The cabin no longer stood, but its echoes stretched across decades. The brothers and their son were gone, yet their choices lingered like a shadow that time itself refused to erase. And so the story endures, whispered by men, remembered by sons, carried in silence. A reminder that grief can twist love, isolation can warp loyalty, and silence can bind men tighter than any chain. In the end, the hills themselves keep the memory. Each rustling tree, each shifting shadow carries echoes of the brothers, their son, and the silence that marked Kentucky forever with a burden men cannot forget.